In the first 2 chapters in this series on the Unification Church Clerics, we learned that, in launching the end of the church era, Reverend Sun Myung Moon sought to shed the Unification Church skin and embark on his original messianic mission, to establish a movement of God-centered families. Instead, his providential plan was undermined by ambition-blinded clerics, seeking power, position, and resources for themselves. To achieve their goals, they enlisted the help of members of Reverend Moon's family, including his wife, Mrs. Hak Ja-han. Through her, they aimed to supplant Reverend Moon's lineal succession plans, dislodging and undermining Dr. Hyun-jin Preston Moon, the true successor. In this chapter we will examine the lengths the clerics went to, advancing their agenda of apostolic succession, within an institutional church framework that they control. The culmination of their satanic acts was the establishment of the so-called Supreme Council, which is a testament to their greed and wicked intention to cast aside the true family, and ultimately undermining God's providence of restoration. For over a decade, Dr. Moon's siblings, Sean, Kook Jin, and In Jin, remained largely inconspicuous and disengaged from public roles. In contrast, Dr. Moon had been a public figure for most of his life, often shielding his siblings' shortcomings and compensating for the problems they caused. He recognized their immaturity and lack of understanding of the principle and God's providence, but never held it against them. Instead, when resentful leaders and members criticized the true family, he always protected them and reminded the membership of their identity, as well as the providential course and significance of the true family. However, the inflated sense of self-worth of certain of his siblings led them to believe they could rival Dr. Moon's leadership. The clerics eventually recruited them and exploited their ambitions. They formed a cabal consisting of Mrs. Han, clerics, and the siblings. In the mid to late 2000s, those siblings were appointed to various key positions by Mrs. Han. Aware of Reverend Moon's sensitivity to public perception, the cabal exploited political opportunities during Dr. Moon's absence from Korea to hastily conduct shotgun inaugurations to give positions to the siblings. These ceremonies, lacking the meticulous planning of past appointments, were conducted surreptitiously and in an expedited manner, often without even informing Reverend Moon. Their appointments happened without Dr. Moon's presence or consent, despite his father's mandate, granting him authority over all leaders and entities. Further, the appointments went contrary to the movement's tradition of involving the outgoing leader in the inauguration of their successor, a practice especially significant for a figure of Dr. Moon's stature as Fourth Adam. In 2008, Sean and Kook Jin brought back their sister, In Jin, who had left the movement, in order to help them take down Dr. Moon. They gave her the fictitious title of Chairperson of the U.S. movement, dispatching her to be in direct conflict with Dr. Moon. The cabal did this, despite Reverend Moon's repeated statements about the limits of In Jin's role. Most notably, in an audio recording from 2008, Reverend Moon specifically said, But the cabal simply ignored his words. The siblings' deficiencies and lack of understanding of Reverend Moon's teachings and divine principle became glaringly evident once they assumed their roles. Sean, in particular, championed the divinization and co-equal status of the true parents, covered in Chapter 2 of this video series, using those contrived theological concepts to undermine Adamic authority. Sean also published an official Unification Church book in 2012 that elevated Mrs. Han's stature, giving her godlike status. He was not only among the first to divinize the true parents, furthering the rift between Reverend Moon and Mrs. Han, but he was also the one who pushed for the notion of an institutional church. Sean aligned himself with the Clerics and catered to Mrs. Han's ego, becoming her foremost advocate and a useful instrument for the Clerics to advance the institutionalization and the anti-providential resurgence of the Unification Church. In 1994, upon declaring the end of the church era, Reverend Moon himself brought down the signboard of the Unification Church, showing his commitment to transcending sectarianism and promoting unity among religions. He set an example for other religious leaders, emphasizing the importance of focusing on universal principles, values, and goals, rather than on denominational and religious doctrinal differences. This act was a manifestation of his vision for a world in which religious communities collaborate and coexist in harmony, moving beyond the barriers of doctrinal divides to foster a peaceful global society of one family under God. In many instances, including in his autobiography, Reverend Moon made clear that his intention was not the creation of a church. As Family Federation president, Sean wore a shirt and a medallion with the Unification Church emblem. He rehoisted the signboard of the Unification Church that Reverend Moon had taken down. Sean then officially changed the name of the Family Federation to Unification Church. Many members, ignorant of the serious providential ramifications of reviving the Unification Church, went along without questioning. The Three Sons framework mentioned in the previous video also reveals what the cabal was after. They divided the Three Sons into three areas: religion under Sean, business under Kook Jin, and what they called the social area, under Dr. Moon. The way the cabal divided the movement into three parts, and put such an emphasis on religion and business, reveals what they valued and coveted. Upon his inauguration, Sean said,
"Many people have told me over the last few years, we're not a church anymore. Why are you focusing on church? Why do ministry? True Father has told us that we are now FFWPU. We've closed down the church, we've opened up the Federation for World Peace, etc. If we remove the religious aspects of the movement, it just pushes us into a social movement. The church is the primary identity of our organization. We'll be focusing on church growth and strengthening the church."
Parroting Sean's sentiment, on February 19, 2010, Kook Jin reportedly said,
"There is confusion in the Unification Church. Are we a messianic movement or a peace movement? Are we a religious movement or a social movement? If we're a peace movement, we're very unsuccessful. If we're a peace movement, then get me out of here. I work without a salary. I don't want to tie to a peace movement. Peace is good, but is that all God is about?"
Monopolizing the bully pulpit of key organizations, these siblings contradicted Reverend Moon's teachings and challenged his providential mandates. What Sean and Kook Jin derogatorily called social work was the providential work of restoration for the building of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Both Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon were ready to sacrifice all of their foundation, including the Unification Church institution, for the sake of the world. Reverend Moon said, "God's purpose is not the salvation of any particular man, church, or nation. God's purpose is to save the whole world. Therefore, the true church would give itself as a sacrifice for the benefit of the world. If this Unification Church exists solely for the benefit of the welfare of the Unification Church itself, then it is doomed to perish." Contrary to the derogatory characterization of calling Dr. Moon's providential work as mere social work, Reverend Moon understood it to be the foundational work to advance God's providence. Indeed, Dr. Moon's vision and work brought the movement to its pinnacle by 2008, with unprecedented success towards national restoration in several countries, to which Reverend Moon was ecstatic. But the successes he was bringing were further impediments to the cabal and their legitimacy. Sean and Kook Jin officially shut down all of Dr. Moon's successful initiatives, where they callously and ignorantly dismantled the reforms and personnel changes that Dr. Moon implemented within the movement, creating a vacuum that was filled, mostly by unqualified, opportunistic individuals who had previously been rejected for leadership roles. Their political calculation was to get rid of anyone and anything associated with their brother. Not recognizing the long-lasting implications their actions would have on the movement. Due to their failed leadership, there was a mass exodus, especially of the second generation in subsequent years, as the schism initiated by the cabal reached a crescendo. But, in return for the two brothers' actions, Mrs. Han and the clerics touted and promoted Sean to the membership as the new successor, and hailed Kook Jin as a genius business leader. Peter Kim said,
"Now Sean is doing his mission after he received mission from Father, now as Father's successor, Father's heir. It's crystal clear. Now Sean is the successor and heir of Father and Mother."
The siblings' glory would be short-lived. Once Mrs. Han and the clerics had thoroughly used Sean, Kook Jin, and In Jin to undermine Dr. Moon, they would be discarded. At the end of the day, the siblings were tools, who reinforced the unprincipled concepts of divinization and co-equal status, as well as the Three Sons framework to members worldwide, while advancing the clerics' agenda of an institutionalized church. This became the framework, not only for the theological schism in the movement, but also for a physical schism, by allowing the assets of the movement to be usurped and misappropriated. Starting from the mid-2000s, Dr. Moon was at the forefront of the movement's providential mission, tirelessly traveling to fulfill the vision of God and Reverend Moon. However, during his absences, the cabal remained in the palace, looking for ways to consolidate their power. The cabal's aim was to do whatever necessary to gain control over key providential organizations. A strategy unprecedented in the movement's history. Under the leadership of Sean and Kook Jin, there was a marked shift towards prioritizing legal control, signaling a departure from alignment with the providential direction and Adamic authority. This was unheard of in a movement that can be characterized as a charismatic, providential, and messianic movement that recognizes the central authority of Adamic figures. This maneuvering led to the cabal wresting control of key entities from the rightful spiritual leadership, including major providential organizations such as Family Federation, Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity in the United States and Japan, the Universal Peace Federation, the Tunyul Foundation, World Carp, and the Youth Federation. This was achieved by exploiting the goodwill of Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon, who had not anticipated such betrayal from within their own family. It is widely known and well documented that ever since the beginning of Dr. Moon's work, he was regularly and strongly chastised publicly by Reverend Moon regarding his new initiatives, due to the clerics' lies and manipulative reporting. Nonetheless, Dr. Moon was steadfast in his conviction that those initiatives would ultimately help realize Reverend Moon's providential goals, and he forged ahead, in essence, putting his neck on the line. Without fail, and usually within 3 years, Reverend Moon would recognize the fruits of Dr. Moon's initiatives, and realized that the clerics had lied to him. In private, but also in public, Reverend Moon would express heartfelt appreciation for Dr. Moon's endeavors, as well as for his unyielding conviction, despite being framed and wrongfully accused. So, when the cabal devised their scheme to incite Reverend Moon to publicly chastise Dr. Moon at a large public gathering in Sokcho, Korea, it was basically the same old thing, and nothing new for Dr. Moon. But the Sokcho meeting was different, because the clerics were joined by Dr. Moon's siblings, and Mrs. Han, who collaborated with a well-scripted plan to make Dr. Moon appear to be publicly crucified by Reverend Moon. In early 2009, Dr. Moon was summoned to Sokcho for what amounted to a kangaroo court in front of his father. At the time, Reverend Moon was mourning the death of his eldest son, Hyo-jin, and was at his most vulnerable. The clerics saw an opportunity to get rid of Dr. Moon. The cabal had manufactured an incident in the board of HSA-UWC USA to create the perception of confusion initiated by Dr. Moon's actions. They reported that Dr. Moon was the source of that confusion. On top of that, the clerics reported that Dr. Moon was creating even further confusion in the movement at large, because he was not aligning with the false hierarchy that the cabal was advancing, and the directives they were issuing. But it was all smoke and mirrors, because Dr. Moon already had authority over all personnel and movement entities. It was within his scope of authority to make changes. But the truth didn't matter to them. The fabricated confusion became the pretext for the clerics to manufacture and present a false spirit world message in Sokcho, and a spirit world letter that they claimed came from the very deceased son, Hyo-jin, whom Reverend Moon was mourning. Their spirit world report claimed to have the solution to the supposed confusion, stating that Spirit World wanted the three sons to come under Mrs. Han, and that Dr. Moon should subordinate to Sean. The false message revealed what the cabal was after, because it advanced the three sons framework, the false succession narrative of Sean, while elevating Mrs. Han's stature and advancing an institutional church framework. Tragically, Reverend Moon believed it to be real, and instructed all those in attendance, including Dr. Moon, to accept the words from Spirit World. Dr. Moon took the full brunt of these satanic accusations, so that other leaders under him didn't have to face it. He defended his subordinate directors to prevent their condemnation. The clerics succeeded in having Reverend Moon crucify his son publicly, demanding he accept the agenda laid out in the kangaroo court that they had manufactured. The depravity and hypocrisy of the clerics was on full display. With their actions, they undercut Reverend Moon's succession plan, thereby violating the three kingships, destroying the true family, crucifying the true successor, and supplanting the true family with a satanic church that they control as apostles. The clerics did this, while taking advantage of the elderly Reverend Moon at his most vulnerable time, by abusing his affection for his deceased son. In retrospect, Reverend Moon's calling the clerics worse than Lucifer seems too kind. The truth of the cabal's deception came to light, because, due to pressure from a large membership base, cleric Chang Shik-yang later acknowledged in a public letter that he was actually the author of the fake Spirit World report, and revealed that he wrote it at Mrs. Han's instruction. Reverend Moon was becoming especially frail when his age was nearing 90. In the mid-2010s, Reverend Moon came to realize the mistake he made at Sokcho, and tried to reverse course. He wanted to reinstate Dr. Moon to his role leading the movement. But when he tried to reverse the directions he gave at Sokcho, his handlers shut him down, and ignored him. Tragically, he had become completely dependent on Mrs. Han, Peter Kim, and Wonju McDevitt. They controlled his physical movement, with whom he could come into contact, and the communication he both gave and received. They kept him isolated under their control. The reason for this was simple. Reverend Moon was becoming more agitated and upset at Mrs. Han, the clerics, and siblings, for scheming against Reverend Moon's will and trying to chase out Dr. Moon. As such, it is a miracle that the Hoondok video, in which Reverend Moon calls out the clerics for being worse than Lucifer, was even exposed. After the Sokcho incident, when the cabal removed Dr. Moon from UPF and installed Sean Moon as its president, Reverend Moon called for Sean's inauguration to be cancelled, and for Dr. Moon to be reinstated. Yet, the cabal ignored Reverend Moon's instructions, struck them from the record, and continued on as if nothing happened. Completely frustrated, Reverend Moon had no opportunity except for public appearances, to air his disgust at the treatment that he and his son were receiving. That's why in several public events, Reverend Moon expressed his anger towards his wife, saying that he had no wife. Something that he would never have done before. Reverend Moon not only lambasted his wife for her providential betrayal, but also directed his anger towards Sean and Kook Jin, who were making a mockery out of him and the movement, and were leading the crucifixion of their elder brother. On several occasions, he said that Sean was not the successor, and that he did not appoint Kook Jin to the positions he held. He called for them to bring back Dr. Moon, and to unite with his son. On May 15 of 2011, while visiting Germany, Reverend Moon reportedly said, "Hyunjin should not be harmed. Stop everything you are doing against him. Peter Kim and Dong Moon Ju, those two bastards made the situation like this. I know they are the enemies." Reverend Moon's outbursts threatened to undermine their entire agenda. Therefore, the cabal made the decision to minimize, and later completely eliminate, all video feeds of Hoondok sessions for fear of Reverend Moon contradicting and exposing them for what they were. And Unification Church members were induced to participate in the Clerics' providential crime. Due to the Clerics' efforts to hide and subvert Reverend Moon's true intention, and the betrayal that the Clerics instigated, through Reverend Moon's own family, to dislodge his lineal successor, members were made complicit in their crime. Instead of listening to Reverend Moon, members worldwide aligned themselves with the Clerics, and willingly or inadvertently participated in undermining the messianic figure, Reverend Moon, and his true successor and only other Adamic figure, Dr. Moon. What's worse, is that the Clerics were not only ignoring Reverend Moon's words, but they were also actively altering them. Reverend Moon was very clear with regards to his holy texts. He instructed that not one letter should be changed, to preserve his words for posterity. But, as soon as Reverend Moon was admitted to the hospital in the final days of his life in 2012, the Clerics and Mrs. Han went to the History Compilation Committee, to start the process of modifying Reverend Moon's texts. Under the guise of updating outdated content, the Clerics removed references to anything concerning the schism, providential directives, and the significance of Dr. Moon, and anything expressing Reverend Moon's desire to unite with Dr. Moon. They also removed anything derogatory about Mrs. Han, the siblings, and the Clerics, altering and republishing many of the holy texts. The infamous bedroom video was another tragic instance of elder abuse that revealed the level of wickedness of these actors. Even with the cabal's maneuvering to place Sean as new successor, and the Soksho incident, they still could not stop Dr. Moon. Because members would not believe them, the cabal decided they needed to have a video of Reverend Moon condemning his son. This is the so-called Heretic and Destroyer video.
성모분들을 인정을 안 하니까 그 이름을 좀 살려주시고.
아니 이름이 뭐야 정신이 반부보다 문영진인데.
아니 근데 지금 현실이 그래서.
This June 2010 video shows a fragile and confused Reverend Moon, awakened in the very early morning, reluctantly going along with Mrs. Han and Sean, who were relentlessly goading him to sign a declaration against Dr. Moon. Even under all that pressure, Reverend Moon refused to write his son's name on the document. Reverend Moon told his wife that if she wanted to put his name, then she should sign the document with her own name instead.
아니
그 강비들하고 우리 현질이 이런 적을 쓰지 않는 거야.
예, 알아요. 충분히 알아요.
누구도 쓰고.
그러니까
The clerics used the declaration signed in the bedroom video as propaganda to support their lie that it was the true parents' direction that Sean was heir, to claim that Dr. Moon was a heretic and destroyer, and to further cement the unprincipled institutionalization of the Unification Church. These same lies became the basis in some 30 lawsuits against Dr. Moon and his supporters. They were also the catalyst for the crucifixion tours, in which clerics maliciously attacked the fourth Adam with their fraudulent narrative, which cemented the physical schism. Years later, when Mrs. Hahn was confronted with that video during a deposition, she said that it was Sean who had pushed for that document, and she disavowed Sean as being the successor. This, despite the fact that it was she who had advocated for him in front of Reverend Moon and the entire movement, through the clerics. After being cast out, Sean Moon claimed that the heretic and destroyer document that Reverend Moon signed in the bedroom video was not about his brother, Dr. Moon, but that the heretic and destroyer was in fact Mrs. Hahn. The level of underhanded backstabbing among members of the cabal is in itself astounding, which only confirms that everything they did was a sham, without any merit to begin with. Unification Church members are not free from blame. Although much of the responsibility falls on the clerics, who lied to and misled the members about Reverend Moon's intentions and directions. It was the blind acceptance by the members that allowed this travesty to unfold. Since the divine principle and Reverend Moon's own teachings clearly explained the truths. The most loyal and faithful son, who had been recognized as the fourth Adam, and had been leading the movement to the highest heights by his father's side for over a decade, was in the blink of an eye, branded as a traitor and fallen Adam. If Unification Church members had paused to reflect, rather than blindly accepting the lies, they would have recognized that the clerics had mounted the entire campaign for their own self-serving agenda, destroying Reverend Moon's marriage, his family, and the Unification movement in the process. At the same time, they also did away with whatever legitimacy the movement had in the eyes of the general public, as champions of God's principles and values, rooted in the ideal of the true family. After Soksho and the bedroom video, the clerics openly attacked Dr. Moon through public tours and smear campaigns, aimed at members. This, too, had never occurred before in the history of the Unification movement, not even toward those leaders and members who deserved criminal accusation, let alone against the true family, and especially the fourth Adam. All these acts were done and justified, in the name of true parents. Through these tours, they incrementally pushed Dr. Moon out, so that he could not respond to any allegations. The clerics had the bedroom video declaration recorded, to present it to members worldwide. A leaked email revealed who were really the ones behind the supposed true parents' declarations. The diabolical nature of the clerics is reflected in an email by Peter Kim to Dongmo Shin, where he gloatingly wrote,
"Are the members eating up the declaration that true father signed in person and we sent to you this time? One thing I regret is that we couldn't get him to write the 3 words, Hyunjin Moon, into the declaration. If another declaration is needed in the future, we will make it to include his name, and it could work as an ultimatum."
As this leaked email suggests, their primary concern was the impact of the manufactured documents on the larger membership, to have them participate in their satanic acts. Less than 1 year later, in May of 2011, the clerics once again manufactured and promoted another statement, using the true parents' names. As seen in the letter between Peter Kim and Dongmo Shin, they took advantage of Reverend Moon, and violated the innate trust members have in his name. This time, with the intent to take control of UCI. With the new declaration in hand, clerics held tours titled, rally of the global membership to proclaim and uphold the Declaration of True Parents, with elder leaders like Youngwee Kim, Jun Soo Young, Sa Kilja, Bo Hee Pak, Hideo Oyamada, Gentaro Kajikuri and others, rallying members. Second-generation leaders, including Kyung Sa-kyu, Jin Hwa-jung, Richard Bach, were part of that effort, as well as Joshua Cotter, Phyllis Kim, Jun Ho-suk, Eiji Takuno, among many others. The purpose of their character assassination campaign was to portray Dr. Moon as someone who betrayed his father over money and assets. And it served them to create a basis to justify legal action. The tours were a concerted effort to damage the image of Dr. Moon and intimidate members, telling them that anyone who associates with Dr. Moon will be a pariah. Some of the dirtier threats included barring members from the blessing ceremony and threatening them that they would not have Sunhwa rites at their funeral. They put the label of the Kwak group squarely on anyone remaining with Dr. Moon, to separate and ridicule those who supported him. These malicious presentations went on with no fact-checking, and were designed to pull at the heartstrings of gullible members, who simply believed the clerics that somehow Dr. Moon was acting against his father. In Korea and Japan, the clerics and siblings went so far as to demand that church leaders video record themselves pledging allegiance, not to God, the true family ideal, the divine principle, or the providence, but to Sean, and the clerics' version of the Unification Church, to a divinized version of the true parents, to the clerics' authority, and to their godless institutional hierarchy. Their loyalty pledge had to include a promise to oppose Dr. Moon and align with his brother Sean. Those who refused to comply were promptly fired and made a pariah. Having succeeded in labeling Dr. Moon a fallen Adam, who betrayed Reverend Moon, the cabal schemed to mount their next attack, litigation. Desiring control over all the movement's entities and assets, the cabal made preparations to take whatever remained under him. The notion of using litigation was the brainchild of Kook Jin, which the clerics wholeheartedly adopted. Kook Jin, and clerics Peter Kim and Dong Moon Ju, colluded to bring a legal case against Dr. Moon, utilizing Reverend Moon's name to manufacture a legal basis to wrest control of the movement's entities away from the rightful heir. As the movement had always emphasized forgiveness and redemption, using litigation was previously unthinkable. Yet, the cabal had now conceived a diabolical plan to position Reverend Moon as the one ordering legal attacks against his own son. In October of 2009, Peter Kim and Dong Moon Ju, as board members of UCI, which was the only major asset under Dr. Moon at the time, told Reverend Moon an outright lie. They said that Dr. Moon had stolen $7 million from UCI. They knew full well that Reverend Moon had already approved the use of these funds. Their malicious lie was intended to trigger Reverend Moon's ire against Dr. Moon, so that his spontaneous reaction could be used to justify a legal campaign against Dr. Moon. Based on Reverend Moon's knee-jerk response, in which he demanded that Dr. Moon be forced to return those funds, they managed to make it look like Reverend Moon had ordered a lawsuit against his own son. The cleric's method was simple and overused: present a false report to Reverend Moon to provoke a reaction from him. If his response suited their purpose, they would utilize it. If Reverend Moon reacted unfavorably, they would simply ignore what he said. No one would ever know. One example of the cabal invoking Reverend Moon's name to justify attacking Dr. Moon was captured in an audio. The following transcript is from an SOC USA board meeting conference call, in which Peter Kim spoke to the board members, and in particular Kook Jin, who was not even a board member, and should not have been in the meeting. Peter Kim said,
Now, but one thing he clearly suggested or guided and directed to us is that legal means to get the UCI back without hurting anybody. And that doesn't mean that we really have to take anybody to the court and receive judgment from the court. But by utilizing this legal way, we can probably bring the people who took the UCI away to the kind of negotiation table. That's the kind of the directions and understanding we had this morning. I just had a brief meeting with Mr. Chu and departed.
It was all lies and collusion. The awkward and meandering manner with which Peter Kim was conveying what was supposedly Reverend Moon's most consequential decision, of suing his own son, clearly demonstrates lack of any certainty that such serious and weighty instruction requires. Because the scenario was thoroughly scripted, Kook-jin replied without hesitation.
Well, whatever Father orders, we do. It's just that's Father's orders. We will support whatever Father wants. That.
This contrived and pre-planned board meeting was held with the sole purpose of using Reverend Moon's name to justify and initiate litigation. This is the kind of machination and deceit that was taking place daily behind the scenes, as the cabal was scheming to overthrow Reverend Moon's legitimate successor. Reverend Moon yearned to reach the milestone of Foundation Day for God. Foundation Day could only be realized upon the settlement of the true parents and true family ideal, the basis on which God's sovereignty is built. And Reverend Moon explained the significance of father and son cooperation in the settlement of the true family. On August 2, 2012, 1 month before his passing, and after receiving yet another false report from Peter Kim, Reverend Moon threw a cup of water at Mrs. Han and yelled at her. "Bring back Hyun-jin. There can be no Foundation Day if you don't bring him back." Yet, after Reverend Moon's passing, the cabal falsely claimed that Foundation Day had been established, adding to their satanic transgressions. The truth is that he passed away, without being able to realize his lifelong goal of achieving Foundation Day for God, because of their betrayal. The cabal's atrocities intensified during the time of Reverend Moon's passing in 2012. When he was in the hospital on his deathbed, the clerics withheld from Dr. Moon the information that his father was seriously ill. When Dr. Moon learned this truth, and tried to visit his father at the hospital, Dr. Moon's siblings used physical means and legal threats to stop him. Then, in a most shameful and despicable act, the cabal made the decision to remove Dr. Moon's family from the list of bereaved family members and enlisted members as a human blockade on the road to prevent him from attending his father's funeral. Such a vile and disdainful act is unheard of in Korean culture, even among the lowest of the low. None of this could have occurred without Mrs. Han's participation and approval. Heaven has all but left the institution of the Unification Church. Their actions have been cursed. This is reflected in how the Unification Church has begun to implode, in scandal after scandal since Reverend Moon's passing. Without oversight, and devoid of Adamic authority, the clerics indulge themselves, and continue on with the sole purpose of maintaining power. Inevitably, everything they do fails. The assassination of Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister of Japan, by a former Unification Church member brought to light the controversial relationship between Japanese politicians and the Unification Church. The clerics had always relied on the Unification Church of Japan to sustain their financial mismanagement and corruption, but its viability is now in question. This is putting tremendous financial strain on the only begotten daughter regime, as their corruption and incompetence are leading to its financial ruin. While the Unification Church was squeezing Japanese members for donations and impoverishing families, the clerics were using those public funds to build an extravagant golden calf-like palace that serves no providential purpose. Furthermore, the clerics were using public funds to gamble and line their pockets. Major news media and other sources reported that clerics, including Chang Shik-yan, Ki-hoon Kim, Wonju McDevitt and others collectively gambled away some $43 million in Las Vegas, just between 2008 and 2011. The clerics were not only corrupt, their track record of bad management shows that they were also incompetent. The last few years have seen a fire sale of Unification movement properties worldwide. Up to the date of this video, many have been sold or put for sale, despite Reverend Moon's instructions never to sell them. Unification Church USA President, Damian Dunkley, recently told clerics that the New Yorker hotel is, quote, in crisis. It has been mortgaged into a precarious state. Dunkley also said the Washington Times is unsustainable, as it is, quote, bleeding $800,000 per month. Every initiative, business, and project that the clerics touch is poisoned and cursed by their incompetence and corruption. Another major reason the clerics are incompetent is nepotism. Without any oversight, clerics install family members into key positions to maintain their power base and extract the movement's resources. For example, Wonju McDevitt, who was formerly Mrs. Han's hairdresser, today wields ultimate power behind the OBD throne. She has placed her sister and her son, brother, husband, and 2 brothers-in-law in high positions of major organizations that were formerly part of the movement. Other clerics, such as former Secretary General of Family Federation, Young Ho Yoon, also installed family members in key positions and offered them lucrative arrangements and contracts. In betraying Adamic authority, the OBD has given the satanic clerics free rein. With Reverend Moon's passing, and after chasing out the 4th Adam, the clerics had no obstacles to achieve their goals. That has led to the destruction of Reverend Moon's family, and his lineal succession plan, to be replaced with a church institution centered on apostolic succession, through the Supreme Council. Divorced from God, true family, and the Adamic figure. The Supreme Council they created is an encapsulation of the institutionalized Unification Church in the form of the OBD cult, mentioned in the second video of this series. The council is comprised of clerics that Mrs. Han recognizes as being loyal to her OBD agenda. The council was first announced in February of 2014, together with the Chano-guk Constitution, after Reverend Moon's passing, and without his knowledge or endorsement. The clerics discarded the original draft of the Chano-guk Constitution that Reverend Moon had been working on, and made a new one to ensure their control. As it is designed, the Supreme Council is intended to have oversight and authority over every aspect of the institution, including theological, organizational, legal, and financial control. The members include 1 daughter and 2 daughters-in-law. However, the real authority is in the hands of the rest of the clerics, who are free to exercise their control, especially after Mrs. Han passes away. To establish this Supreme Council, the clerics took advantage of Mrs. Han's naivete and pride, to fill her mind with a false and deluded sense of herself over many years, that eventually led to her OBD theology. The tragedy is that in blind pursuit of her personal ambition, Mrs. Han was ultimately taken advantage of by the clerics, and her agenda eventually succumbed to theirs. Mrs. Han has been instrumental in wresting the core parts of the movement away from the proper and legitimate Adamic authority, and placing them in the hands of the clerics, who became the real holders of power. Her rejection and betrayal of her husband and son, and instituting the Supreme Council, effectively gave clerics control over organizations and assets that belong under Adamic authority, and, thereby, helping clerics establish their apostolic succession model. However, this evil regime devoid of Adamic authority stands against heaven, and it will continue to yield bad fruits until it perishes. As Jesus said, they shall be known by their fruits. Dr. Hyunjin Moon prophetically exposed the actions of the clerics in his letter to Reverend Moon in March 2008, titled Report to Parents. His letter not only served as a blueprint to understand Reverend Moon's original direction for God's providence, but it foresaw the real possibility that these clerics could become the satanic instruments that advance their unprincipled church-centric agenda at the expense of the messianic mission and God's providence of salvation. Dr. Moon's concerns unfortunately came to pass. And the biggest tragedy was that Reverend Moon was unable to offer Foundation Day to God, which was his lifelong mission and dream, because there was no foundation of unity set for him to stand upon. Yet, God's work is not bound by human failure. It continues to be carried out through His chosen figures and their families. Presently, God's providence is being advanced through the Adamic figure of Dr. Moon and his family, continuously victorious and reaching unprecedented heights, in spite of the betrayal and attempts to thwart his work. Members worldwide can re-examine themselves and commit to stand with God through repentance and proper alignment to the true Adamic authority, as we all must realize our own 5% portion of responsibility. This video serves as a stark reminder of the importance of knowing the principle and the consequences of straying from God's path. Let us reflect on these lessons and commit to embracing the divine guidance of the Adamic authority, ensuring that we are aligned with God and His providence. As we move forward, our next video will explore the role of the founders of the Sanctuary Church, Hyunjin Sean Moon and Kookjin Moon, in the schism and the lamentable and irredeemable state they find themselves in today.